I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara peoples as the traditional owners of the lands where I work and live and the place where we meet today. Their vast lands stretch north and south of the Brisbane River and all the way out to the Great Dividing Range. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and indeed I extend my respects to all First Nations people right across Australia and also for our ANZSOG partners in Aotearoa. I recognise the Torres Strait Islander people's enduring connection to country, to the land, to the seas and the waterways, and their ongoing and alive cultures. Many of you who are joining us on the webinar today will probably be familiar with Woolloongabba. This is the home of the famous Gabba ground, and it's just east from where we're sitting today. The name Woolloongabba is actually thought to be a Turrbal word, and it derives from fight, talk, place, or whirling waters. So whatever way you look at it, I think it's particularly apt in its current context. So next time you're watching the footy or the cricket or whatever your sport of choice is that's coming to you from the Gabba, hopefully you will be reminded of Meanjin and the fact that this is Turrbal Yagara country. I am Victoria Thomson. I'm the Deputy Director General for Liquor, Gaming, Fair Trading, and it's my absolute pleasure to be the facilitator for today's webinar. Before I introduce our speakers, I will go through a few housekeeping arrangements about how today's webinar is going to go. So first and foremost, all of the ANZSOG webinars are recorded. They'll be made available on the ANZSOG YouTube channel, which I'm sure many of you have already found your way to over time. We'll also be preparing a short video of some of the key points from today's webinar, which is so fantastic for all of us who are incredibly time poor. And you can access that through our social channels. We'll be using a Q&A function in Zoom for people online today, and I do encourage you to do this. This is your webinar more than it is ours, so if you have those questions, get them posted. We'll leave a heap of time at the end after the speakers to take those questions. And if you like the look of the question, as always, you can upvote and get that question moved to the top of your list. I've got the little black box here so I can see those questions coming in. And also our speakers today have been very generous. Not only are they here to take us through their topics, but they've also agreed to answer some of those questions offline if we can't get to them during the course of the event. So as I said before, I've got a fairly big task of leading us through, I think, a really incredibly important area about good regulatory communications. And I was having a bit of a ponder about this topic as I was preparing for the webinar. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, is there another area of regulatory activity that has changed so much in the period of time that I've been involved as a regulator? And I was thinking back to my days when I first joined Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, and the comms team, they were very busy, they were great people, and their job involved pretty much form design, getting forms published in triplicate and all of that sort of stuff, and sending the forms out, and doing it, crafting, you know, some regulatory brochures. And that was comms. And then, of course, came the internet, you know, the big black box. And all of a sudden we went from the copy and the brochures to posting the content on the website. And really, I think it was the same sort of content, but just a different publishing mechanism when we first started, right? Then came the advent of the 24/7 news cycle. And all of a sudden, us regulators were run around, you know, constantly responding to questions and queries and the latest crisis. And in some ways, that really hasn't changed for us, has it? Then the rise of social media in all of its glorious and inglorious forms. And I remember the nervousness from regulators and particularly our comms teams about, you know, how do we actually control this beast? Short answer is you can't. And what do you do when people say bad stuff about the regulator on Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever? And more recently, of course, we've seen the rise of digital and in graphics. as a way of getting attention, of building capacity and humanising our communications. And I think as regulators, we are getting very good at telling those short stories and using them as a form of influence to the audiences that we're trying to reach. And now, of course, we're moving into this era of partnering and co-design. And once again, regulators are being challenged about how much we control the narrative and how much we have to let go to others in the communication space. And the journey continues. Now what we're talking about right across government is obviously cultural capability. It's about including people from all parts of the community. It's about embedding a citizen's perspective in the policy, in the regulatory policy making, but also in the service delivery as well. And how do we as regulators think about that in everything that we communicate? So our communication approach obviously needs to be agile. It needs to be crafted. It's an art. It needs to be crafted to suit the circumstances, the regulatory approach that we want to take, the harm that we're seeking to minimise, who we're trying to control and influence, and the regulatory posture that we want to portray. So this is a really complex, I think, space that we're all working in. And you know, we really need to be flexible. And of course, all of us in the room know how flexible regulators are. If only them out there would get that as well. So don't be overwhelmed by all of that and my little history lesson of the last 20 years of being a regulator as per Victoria, because today we've got a couple of really great speakers here with us who will generously share their expertise and help us all think a bit more deeply about how we can deliver good regulatory communications. So before I introduce you to the panel, it is with regret that I have to tell you that one of our speakers, Ruth William, who's the General Manager of the ACCC Strategic Communications Branch, is unfortunately unable to join us due to illness. And I know Ruth was really devastated not to be able to be here with us. We wish her a very speedy recovery, but what it means for us is that we have more time with these guys here and with you, our audience. So in the order that they will be speaking, I will introduce Jarrod Cowley-Grimmond. Jarrod is a senior executive with the Queensland Government with expertise in leadership, regulation, policy, project management and corporate administration. Jarrod has been involved in advising governments on the regulation of financial services, corporations, taxation, environment, markets, public health and major infrastructure. So quite a suite that you're over there, Jarrod. He trained as a lawyer and also as an economist. He's practiced law in Australia and in the UK for around 12 years before moving into government here in Australia, but prior to that in the United Kingdom. Jane Reid has worked in communications and engagement since 1999 when she joined Treasury as a graduate in the whole of government GST implementation team. Wow, that was a big job. Moving into gambling regulation, she implemented the world's first responsible gambling awareness campaign, which won the National Australian Marketing Institute of Australia Award for social marketing. Then she shifted into transport and Jane managed the Road Safety Marketing and Communications Unit for Queensland, managing the delivery of mass media communications as well as client campaigns. During this time, her work was recognised by the Australian Marketing Institute of Australia for the Share My Story campaign and also the redevelopment of young driver materials. And Jane received international recognition for the online speeding campaign, What Davo Loves. I had to Google that yesterday, Jane.
Yeah.
I loved it. and the corollary of that was what Davo hates,
Yes.
which was very clever. Anyway, I digress. So each of our speakers will speak for approximately 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will, as I say, open up through Zoom for some questions. So to kick us off, Jarrod, I believe you're going to really get us into some bread and butter regulatory stuff. How we can pull together our regulatory strategy with our posture and our communications. Thank you, Jarrod.
Thanks, Victoria.
Today I'm going to talk a bit about the how. I think we all understand that regulatory communications is a critical tool in our arsenal. It's really important to make sure that you are effective in communicating and using the media to deliver your outcomes. So that's a given. What I really want to talk about is the journey that we've been on in starting with a bit of a blank piece of paper, and how do you actually do it on the ground? How do you generate content? How do you make sure your stakeholders are engaged? How do you actually be more effective in that space when you're coming from a very kind of low base? So this comes back to the journey that our department's been on. So Department of Regional Development, Manufacturing and Water has only been around for about 2 years. We were created in the machinery of government change back at the last election, where the water resource management functions in the old DNRME were taken out of that department and merged into regional development and manufacturing, which was a department with a very economic development focus. So that was a surprise. Machinery of government changes always throw up something interesting, but it also presented us with a huge challenge, but an opportunity. The challenge was that we had come from an organisation that was very established, had good systems and processes, had a very broad regulatory remit, and we needed to sort of start from scratch with a much more focused, narrower regulatory framework. So and we needed to stand that up in 6 months, because we kind of took what we could from our old department, but we really needed a blank piece of paper. And that was the opportunity that we had, was that blank piece of paper. How are we going to do regulatory communications better? How do we start from the ground? I'm a pretty simple person. I like to think, like, what are my existing tools that I've got? How can I actually use this to deliver the outcome that I want? No need to reinvent the wheel, but start from scratch and start from first principles. Also talk a little bit about the role, being a regulator and being a communicator in a department where you have a minister. That's the function that we have, and that relationship between the Minister's office and the department is something that I think is a really important relationship to get right when you're going to do regulatory comms. In a statutory body or an independent public official, it's different, because you're not accountable necessarily to a minister, but you still have commissioners and you still have your appointed official that you need to make sure is on board with the process. So I think the principles are the same, but I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of a regulator sitting within a department that is ultimately accountable to a minister. So it's all about building that relationship at the outset. So we started our journey with just to start with why. We are a regulator. We regulate a whole range of things in water resource management, dam safety, drinking water, rural water take, the bore drilling industry, quarrying in rivers. It's a really broad regulatory remit. And we'd come to an agency that had a really heavy economic development focus. So the first thing is to just explain what it is you do and why you do it. And think carefully about your language when you're in those conversations. So I was always trying to look at, okay, how do I explain this in a way that is most aligned with what those staffers are familiar with, what their sort of agenda is, because that's the easiest way to start that conversation. So we talked about things like, if we're going to regulate water, it's about making sure that people who own water have secure entitlements, that there's water available for economic development, that the water market is going to work effectively. So our regulation is about those sorts of things, but it also does an environmental outcome. And that all regulation will have multiple kind of objectives, and just explaining it to them in a way where it is familiar to them and it aligns with what they're trying to achieve is the first part of the conversation. Be clear about the role of the department versus the role of the Minister's office. I often say to my staff, Parliament chose to confer these powers on the Chief Executive. Parliament, or the Auditor General, will one day turn up and ask the Chief Executive, what did you do with those powers? You really need to explain that these are departmental responsibilities. So this is some of the groundwork. And I use language like, I'm just informing you, I'm keeping you abreast of this issue, this is a matter that's coming up. And I've never, ever in my experience as a public servant, ever had any issues with that clear delineation between what is a departmental decision and what is the ministerial responsibility. So once you've kind of got all of your key stakeholders, and I consider the Minister's office to be a key stakeholder across what you do, Then it's kind of your bread and butter basic stuff. You're going to need a regulatory strategy. You're going to need a compliance plan. You're going to need to explain what it is you're going to do over the next 12 months, 2 years, 5 years. Once you've got those sort of foundation documents in, it's then how do you convert that into a media strategy? And this is where we sat down with our media team and we developed an operational policy that says this is how we're going to do it. And it was delivered by the media team, not by the department. And I think that's a critical thing for everybody to understand, is that when you're doing this stuff, you need your media team in early. You need them in the conversation right at the outset, and you also need to recognise that they work in a different environment and to a different time frame than us. They're dealing with a 24-hour news cycle. They're dealing with inquiries from across government, from central agencies, from ministers, from if you've got GOCs or things that report to you. So their timeframes are different, and whatever policy or process you come up with should fit their timeframes and not yours. You'll have a much more effective result if you do that. So we articulated and drafted up this policy, and then it's socialise, socialise, socialise. Get your minister's office across it, get your Director General across it, get your key stakeholder across it. One of the things that we did was really articulate that 90% of our regulatory comms is going to be supportive, education, informing people, visibility, because most of what we do is actually telling people what the rules are and how to comply, and then being visible in the community and making sure that we're out there being visible. So, and about 10% is that corrective, we're prosecuting this person, we're going to run this campaign, etc. And we started with that approach of we wanted to kind of build up to the point at which everybody was comfortable with what we were doing around the media side of things. And that really helped in just building confidence in what we were doing, because it was kind of unfamiliar for the agency that we'd come to, because it was really focused on economic development and those sorts of things. So yeah, we use this sort of 90% information and 10% corrective. We had the policy signed off, everybody was comfortable with it. That's great, I've got all of the documents in place. How do I get content? Media is not something that the media team can generate the content for. So we needed to change how our regulatory officers thought about their role in delivering content that the media team can use. Media, it's really critical that you give your media team good content on a regular basis so that they've got material. Social media is fantastic, but you need to make sure that it's engaging, that it's regular, that you're constantly refreshing it. It is a great way to talk directly to your audience instead of using, mainstream media where you've got to go through the filter of whatever the news organisation wants to put out there. So you've really got to use it, but you've got to be really proactive and use it a lot. So as a Sparrow kind of student of Sparrow, I thought, okay, I need to change the behaviour of my staff. What are the regulatory tools I've got to do that? And so I stuck with the basics. Put it in your business plan and then start having conversations with PDAs. So I made all of my directors responsible for delivering a certain number of the content for a certain number of media posts each year, which was a bit of a challenge for some of them, because it's like, that's a media problem, not my problem. So that's the first step, is put it in some way that you can make people accountable, and then give them the information and support to enable them to do it. So train people. We got our media team to sit down with our regulatory officers and teach them how to shoot footage on an iPhone, how to shoot a photo on an iPhone. Other brands of smartphone are available. And then start teaching them. Regulation is not media. Successful regulatory comms is not about pins and prosecutions. It's about, I'm out visiting a landholder, I'm doing an audit, here's a couple of photos in my staff in high-vis, the real basic stuff. And then we started generating content. So and I model that myself. So when I'm out in the field doing a site visit, I'll take photos and things like that, and we'll do some engagement in that place. So leading by example and encouraging your officers that when you're in the field, it's part of your role to take photos and generate content is a critical issue. Remember behavioural insights. So you can achieve significant outcomes from a regulatory space simply by being visible. There's two examples. So we We are currently rolling out a new satellite imagery system where we'll be able to see people taking water from rivers and putting it in dams from space. We're currently working on rolling that out and publicising it. And just the fact that we can observe this sort of behaviour will change behaviour on the ground, provided you're telling people about it. We had a similar thing in the old department with veg clearing, where every 2 weeks we had satellite imagery and we could see trees cleared. People got a letter 2 weeks after they'd cleared trees saying, please explain. And that visibility is really important, and making sure people see that you're out there and they're aware of things. Finally, when it does come to the pointy stuff, you've got a prosecution, you've got a major incident that you need to do some media around, there should be a no surprises approach, particularly with ministers' offices, central agencies. If you're at the point where you're about to put a press release out because you're launching a prosecution against someone, which you do need to do, that should be no surprise to anyone, because you've started some time ago, you've kept people informed. It is not about seeking permission or seeking approval, but it is just simply that no surprises space. So if you've laid the groundwork and you've done your job effectively, by the time you get to that point, it's just a matter of course. I've had conversations with ministerial advisors where you've laid it all out and they've said, based on what you've told me, I don't see you've got any other option. That's a great outcome because they're all on side with you. But they do need to know, because they're the ones who are going to get asked a question in Parliament, and what I do understand is they don't like surprises. So I think that's kind of the journey that we've been on. I'm happy to take some questions and talk a bit more about the nuts and bolts, but hopefully that was helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Jarrod. A couple of things that I've written down actually, just in response to your comments, and I'm, going back to that when, and don't we all love the joy of machinery of government changes? The gift that keeps giving for about a term before the next one. So what I'm reminded of though is, that tension that many regulators in the room and online, when you're in an agency that has that economic development slant, and how you reconcile those sometimes, I won't call them conflicting, but certainly, different parts of the same organisation working towards different goals, and how you can reconcile that tension and, proving our point and communicating. I mean, we talk a lot today about externally, but I think your point is about how do we communicate our role as regulators internally, in government, with ministers, and with our own internal stakeholders. And I'm reminded about, if you haven't read it yet, Ari Freiberg did an article not so long ago. He's a great friend of the ANZSOG community, about the benefits of regulation for market efficiency, which we are picking up in our organisation to, when we talk to industry, there's always that thing about, government and rules and, getting in our way. Well, actually, there's another regulatory story as well, and it is about that efficiency in the market and creating that space where people are competing. I won't use the word level playing field, because as regulators, again, we all love that, don't we? But competing in a way that is right, and ethical and moral and legitimate and legal. So I love that point. Socialisation, socialising plans. I think, again, in our communications, we spend an awful lot of time developing stuff, and then sometimes we just fail to execute that socialisation piece, don't we? And trading on the good regulatory communications that we've already developed, and repackaging it and recycling it and upcycling it, and using it for all those different various channels that I talked about before. So you made me really think about that. And, just that constant keeping the message fresh. I talk about feeding the beast, these social media channels that we have, and how do we feed the beast all the time and come up with fresh content and different ways of approaching it. So thank you for that, and we'll definitely take you up on your offer for more questions about the tin tax at the Q&A time. Jane, over to you.
Okay, all right. Hi, everyone. Firstly, let me just say, we're all communicators. We communicate in writing, verbally, and without words. We communicate with our friends, our families, our colleagues, our clients, our stakeholders, in person, over the phone, via email, digitally, every day. Some days we get it right. Remember when you've been in that meeting and you just knew they got it. They picked up every point, you were all on the same page, everyone was working in the right direction. But also remember that day when you walked into that meeting and it felt like you were talking another language, and somebody looked at you and they just went, "Girlie, I don't know what you're talking about. What do you want me to do?" And if anybody can give me the secret of communicating with a teenage boy and getting that message across, I'll be eternally grateful. The point is that every day, sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we really think about what the message is that we want people to take away from what we're saying. We really craft our message with them in mind. And other days you wonder how telling someone that their socks are in the drawer where they're always kept translates to the fact that they're in the wardrobe or maybe on the ceiling. I tell you, teenagers, they just blow my mind. But because we all communicate, there's an attitude that anyone can deliver your organisation's communication and that it's a simple process. You just bung some words on a page, come up with a catchy, tagline, get a pretty picture, God forbid, find some clip art online, and Bob's your uncle. Don't get me started on clip art. It's my bugbear. But just as engineers and lawyers bring professional expertise to the work that they do, so do communications professionals. And it's our role to help you get your message right, get it to the right people in the right way, at the right time, and using the right methods. Regulatory systems aim to ensure that their sphere of influence is well governed, that it's well managed, that it's viable, that the needs and safety of the public are being protected, and that government has assurance and trust that the system has integrity and it's robust. Good communications will help you achieve those aims by creating communication that has a public interface that's cohesive, it's aligned with your key message, with your objectives, it's comprehensible, it's creative, and it cuts through. In developing material for internal and external audiences, we'll think about the big picture. What are the political and organisational imperatives that you want to achieve? How do we align with them? How do we preserve reputation, promote our brand, and support the business achieve its objectives? Whether that's informing and educating people about regulatory change, is it about setting a standard? Is it about supporting and monitoring? Is it about compliance, encouraging higher performance, or is it about enforcing? So communication professionals bring lots of skills to the table, and they should be a core member of your team from the very beginning when you're developing and amending policy, legislation and regulation. We can be key to your success. Because it doesn't matter how good your regulation is, if people don't know or understand what they need to do or what the costs of not complying are, then it hasn't hit the mark. In fact, you run the risk of opening yourself up to public and media criticism for setting people up for failure. You're eroding trust, and this can have implications for your future endeavours. So top-performing comms teams can assist you in many ways, and in my time in comms, this has involved a whole range of different things. It's coming in with a different lens, questioning thought processes and decisions, asking those questions that quite often when you're sitting in a room with engineers that go, yeah, this is the way to do it, and all of a sudden you walk in and you go, but what does that mean? How are people going to do that? What do they need to do there? Why are we doing this? How are you doing this? And it really frustrates people when you do that right at the end, because when it comes down to it, communication, we can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And if you haven't thought about those things at the beginning, we're really up against it. So get us in early. We bring along a detailed understanding of target audiences and considering how material can be tailored and best delivered to meet their needs. We can draw upon things like market research as well as past successes and failures. So we're not just necessarily looking at market research, but we can bring in lots of different information resources. Analysing customer complaints and compliments. What have customers told us that we've done well, or where have we failed? What's the correspondence about? What are people talking about in terms of our regulation that they're asking questions about that they haven't understood? What's happening in the media and social media reporting? Going back and reflecting at the end of processes and on an iterative basis, what have we learned? What worked and what didn't? and actually then bringing those things into play in future projects. We design and lead engagement with industry, with non-government sector and members of the public to explore the issues, challenges and barriers from their perspective. Work with creatives to create compelling content which attracts attention and cuts through noise. Work with technical experts to actually translate engineer speak, as I like to call it. They don't. Prepare thoroughly and well in advance for launch. We need time to prepare high quality external facing material for launches, whether that's the advertising, whether it's the media, whether it's web, it's socials, it's print. Securing and preparing spokespeople, champions, getting the visual right and having those media kits ready so that we are ready to go and that we've covered off on everything. And then preparing internal communications resources for staff so that they are on point when they are actually out talking to members of the public on the ground. They can answer the questions of, what are you doing? Why did you do it? What will happen if I don't do these things? And how are we going to enforce and monitor this? And then understanding if there are competing priorities occurring across the organisation or environment which could detract from your project or determine the potential for positive and negative impacts, as well as monitoring media and social media and preparing responses to correct misinformation. So a few things I've learnt in my years of working in communications that I'd like to share with you today. And I believe that the key to success is putting people at the centre. First of all, it's not about you. You're amazing, but it's not about you. Good regulatory communication means that you take your personal perspective, opinions and experiences out of the equation. You need to step out of your privilege. Okay? We all come with an element of privilege when we work in this space. We need to put ourselves in other people's shoes. The focus should always be on the audience you're communicating with. Who are they? How old are they? What's their gender? What are the personal characteristics? Where do they live? What is their diversity? What's their cultural background, their religious background? How do they intersect with other members of the community? Do they feel engaged with their community? Do they feel involved? And don't forget intersectionality, because no one comes just ticking one box. I'm a white woman. I live in a regional area. I have a university education, and I bring all of that to the picture when I come into a room to talk to you. What do people think, and why do they think that way? How do they act and make decisions? What will influence them to consider changing their behaviour? So behaviourally, people don't always respond in a way that seems logical. And this is what I mean about stepping out of your privilege. So, for example, talking to young men about the dangers of speeding. You'd think that messages that talk to people about the fact that speeding kills would be compelling. You know, it might change my behaviour. I don't want to die behind the wheel. But it's not. So for them, a more compelling message is the physical changes or impacts that they would sustain in a crash and what that would mean for their life long term. Because to them, when they're dead, they're dead. But if they can't walk, that's a different kettle of fish for them. That's a much more compelling message. Messages showing problem gamblers what they risked were interpreted as what they could win. So a key consideration I'd like you to think about too is how can you avoid in your communication stigmatising and alienating vulnerable communities and potentially causing unintended harm. So think about the things. If you put a particular group of people on a poster, does that actually say something about them? Does that further alienate them and make them not trust you? So think about the implications of your communication. So you need to do the work. You need to really understand and refine your target audiences from the beginning. And the more that you understand who you are communicating with, the more that you can tailor your communication to them and the more successful it will be. Make your communication human and spread your net wide. So we want to support people to understand the regulatory changes, the reasons behind them, where they can access advice and support to implement changes, explain consequences for non-compliance, and engage in considering the benefits of changing attitudes and behaviour and acting on those. So we need to make our communication accessible. We have to translate the technical and make it easier to understand. Plain English. Check your reading level so that it can be understood by everyone. Think about different formats to meet different needs. Not just a brochure, not just a poster. Think about audio, think about visuals, think about symbolic communication, and think about where you need to translate. It has to be audience focused, so write with your audience in mind, tailor your messages, try to chunk information, stay on point and on topic, keep it brief. We say too much all the time. Consider your who, what, when, where, why, and how much questions. What's the core of what the audience needs to understand, and then how can you drive them to more information, whether that's online or in other forms of communication, but keep it brief. And make it available. So use relevant channels of communication for your audiences. What's going to reach them? Is it mass media? Is it social media? Is it print? Is it online? Is it the back of a bus? Is it in a retail store? Is it distribution through organisation and community channels? Is it supporting partners and community leaders to actually be your spokesperson and spread that word out there? And tailor your resources for your staff, because your staff are out talking to people every day. And if they're not on point, then that's when you start to lose people. And invest to get the best. So the success of your regulatory comms will depend on the time and money you invest in getting the best quality. If you want the best results, you need to invest time, involve your comms teams as early as possible, give them time to do the research and the engagement and craft great communication, and develop good media distribution and risk management strategies. Invest in the longevity of campaigns, particularly those where you're seeking to change behaviour. Short-term scattergun approaches won't work. If you're getting traction with a message, build on that success. You need to invest money to make your communication engaging and appealing, cut through the noise and get the information out to people who need to know about it, and invest in your comms teams. Investing in your communication is ultimately an investment in relationships. It speaks volumes about the level of respect you have for your stakeholders and your customers, and it helps either build or erode their trust in you.
Thank you, Jane. Look, there were so many things in that which were just like a how-to, which are fantastic. But I think the one line that I will take out of that and I will use probably on a daily basis is step out of your privilege. We are so into ourselves, aren't we? And so much we know so much as regulators, and I think it comes from a good place as well. We want to share, but we think about things from a very much an ego point of view. Yeah. And so it's a great line. It definitely resonates with me. And that whole thing about staff as a consumer of our communications, again, we mentioned that with Jarrod before. I think that's a really strong message. And we're going to talk more. I'm going to ask you a question about knowing your audience and about engaging with people and the channels that they use rather than the ones that we think that they should, and how we support as regulators those communities that need more of our support, not only just in order to comply, but to thrive. So we'll definitely come back to that. Look, we've got some great questions coming through on the Q&A. I do want to just very quickly though, Ruth was going to talk a bit about mass communications, and she was going to talk about how we actually might work with the media for the public good. I think her topic was how not to be nervous around the media, because we all know that as regulators, we see the requests for the media presentations and the questions coming through, and in a way, it becomes a little bit negative, and gives us white sort of slimy hands when we have to think about doing an interview and whatnot. But one of the things that I think we're all facing in today's world is just how quickly misinformation spreads. And you guys talked about it, people get on our channels and all of a sudden our reputation as a regulator is in tatters. One tweet, one post, there's this big kind of pylon and everybody gets really excited. And I think we've all been involved in, movements against our regulatory decisions or our directions, and COVID-19 I think gave us, well, certainly in the liquor and gaming space, a whole host of examples that we can draw on from there. And before you know it, you've completely lost the narrative. you're on the back foot, you're being defensive, you're spending more of your time defending than you are actually getting your message out that you want to get out. And I think we have all probably felt a little bit powerless against these forces, you know, the influencers and the social movements and the TikTokers and, you know, good thing you've got a teenage son, I've got to say. And I think we probably feel a little bit powerless. So, you know, is there anything that we can actually do to control these risks? And one of the things that I heard about not so long ago that I thought I would share with you as something for, you know, just for you to have a bit to think about, is that work some academics are doing out of the University of Cambridge and other places. And what they're talking about is, you know, as regulators, not letting the misinformation arrive, not waiting for it, and then, you know, we jump into this laborious fact-checking kind of response mode where, you know, no sooner have we pushed one you know, piece of false information down, then another 4 pop up, and we spend our life playing, you know, whack-a-mole with the ball and the hammer, like we're at the Ekka. Sorry, Brisbane reference there. You know, the fear-mongering and the conspiracies and the misinformation spread like virus. So what these academics are talking about is actually pre-bunking misinformation. And what they suggest is that it's a bit like using a vaccine. So what you do, you expose your audience in advance to, I guess, micro doses of the tactics and the tropes that some of these people who spread information tend to do. So you put a little bit of it out. And in a way, it's like when you go and get your injection, you get a little bit of immunity to the misinformation that will come. In today's world, it will come. And so you hope that by doing that vaccination process, that immunisation process, that you're actually educating people so they can see the signs of that misinformation and they become better consumers and make more discerning decisions about the information that they will inevitably be fed through their channels and through their links. So just a little bit of a thought there about how we might, as regulators, think about that within our communications preparation and how we do that pre-bunking through our own channels. And again, using the media in a positive way to help us to prepare community for the information that is to come. So, moving into our Q&A part. Now, I've got some questions here, but there's one on the chat that Jarrod, I think, is really right up your street because it was what you were mentioning before about this tension. So the question that we have is, when you're a regulator within an economic development area, how do you build trust within the community who might see a conflict of interest?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in fact, it's, it becomes even more challenging because not only do you have that in the community, sometimes your own staff might go, well, hang on, what does this mean? I'm in this regulatory agency, but there's this, what does it mean for my role? I always think about, and it comes back to your point earlier, Victoria, is that regulation is always, you can always come up with an economic benefit for regulation. I know that doesn't sound logical, but why do people invest in the Australian Stock Exchange? Because it's regulated, there are rules, it's enforced, and you know that you can trust it. We put our money in banks because they're well regulated. So regulation can actually help support economic activity. And that's the lens that I try to communicate through to ministers and to stakeholders, that if we're getting the rules right, people can have confidence in the market, you'll increase investment and you'll increase economic activity if you've got your regulation right. That's for lots of it. If we're talking about public health or we're talking about other things, well, there's different drivers for it. So one of the spaces that we do is drinking water regulation to make sure that the water that comes out of everybody's tap is of high quality. You know, we sort of go, well, actually, public health is a really important measure. We don't want people to get sick. We want to make sure that the water's of good quality and we want to make sure that it's there when you need it. It's a water security issue. So there are always ways that you can communicate that while you might be an environmental regulator, there are economic benefits associated with that. So that's the story that I sort of say, that I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I don't think that regulation and economic development are mutually exclusive. I think they are actually mutually supportive. You need both. And again, it starts with that conversation about, well, why are we doing what we're doing? And then using really good tools to get that message out there and get in front of that conversation. So I don't think that there's a tension, and if you can explain that effectively to people, then you can manage that conflict.
I think, in the liquor and gambling side of my portfolio as well, you out there in the community, there's, not many people who don't have a view about liquor and gambling and, for example, sports advertising. But, you get these two sort of polar sides of it, with the kind of laissez-faire into the prohibitionist side of it as well. And that this tension as a regulator between harm minimisation and also supporting industry to grow and to develop, provided it doesn't compromise those public harm objectives that we have. So the way that I approach it is firstly, I think also to make very clear that there is that tension, but also to make very clear that the Parliament, through its various acts, has accepted that these are legitimate and legal resources that people have access to, but they are harmful. Hence why there's this whole regulatory regime around it. And what we're about as a regulator is not only ensuring compliance with that, but how we can bring people, including industry and community, together to minimise that harm. And I think the other areas that we look for within, even as a regulator of harms, is to look for those areas of industry where, for example, the artisan liquor licence that we've not long done, and everybody can thank me in Queensland for that later, you can go to your microbreweries and your gin distilleries. But why is that a good thing from an economic point of view, right? It drives tourism, it drives growth in production and markets and all of that sort of stuff. But we also know that it's a less harmful way to consume alcohol. So how do we tell that story? They're not necessarily in conflict. There's not necessarily a conflict of interest. There can be, but we can find ways, I think, to work together. So hopefully that will help answer some of that question. Jane, I'm going to turn to you. I mean, your key message is about, really at the heart of good comms is a heart, right? It is appealing to people in their place, at their time, in the right way. But I guess communities are busy, right? Their life is going on around them. And how do you get that cut through? People will only engage with us if they're interested in what we have to say, and if what we have to say is actually valued by them. It's a conversation that they want to have, and that the regulator is somebody that they trust, right? And, so many communities, and particularly the communities that we as regulators need to give support, have had really bad relationships with government over the years. So my question to you is about what can we do to build those foundations and that social capital that allows us to even get in and start having those positive regulatory communications?
Sure. Okay, so when I think about social capital, it is about trust, it is about engaged citizens, but it's actually about reciprocity as well. So if we want to build trust and engage with people and have reciprocal relationship with them, we need to be consistent in our communications and the importance that we place on it. So it's like you were saying before, Jarrod, it's about having, people putting out posts on a regular basis, showing that they're out there in the community, that they're doing the work, why they're doing the work, how they're working with people, and what the benefit of that work actually is for people. It's not about just going, oh, we've got something to say, I'm going to come out and say it, and you better stop what you're doing and listen to me, because I'm here, I'm in town. That's not how people work at all. They do have very busy lives. And again, it comes down to actually understanding what's happening in their lives and why the communication that we are putting out, what about that is important to them? How do you get the essence of what's in it for them? Why do I pay attention to this? How is it going to make my life better, or keep me out of harm's way, or help me do the job that I want to do, or live in my community, or whatever it might be? So again, it's really about coming to that understanding of who the people are that you're actually communicating with. Investing in communications demonstrates, and understanding your audience demonstrates that respect that you have for them, that you really want to have a relationship. It's like your personal relationships. You actually have to invest time. You know, people aren't sitting around at your beck and call going, oh, here they are. So, yeah, please take the time to invest. And I think the other thing is it's understanding that what you read in the news and what you hear in social media and things like that is not actually always reflective of what the vast majority of the community are thinking. So the loudest voices don't always represent everybody. They will often be coming with their own agenda, their own, goal that they want to get out of that. So again, understanding that what the community is thinking more broadly means that you can actually respond to those things. I think the other thing too is thinking about the noise that's out there. Are you going out with comms when there is lots of other change that's already happening? And how is this confusing to people? They go, oh, this person's doing this and this person's doing this and this doesn't seem to align with one another. So actually investing in your relationships across the regulatory environment as well to get that understanding of who's doing what changes, where is that impacting, when are they going into community? Are you able to align some of your messages so that, again, you're not trying to overwhelm people? And I think the other thing is also being aware that if you're out there and you're expecting people to engage with you on your timeframes, and government's really good at going, right, it's Monday to Friday, it's 9 to 5. Guess what? Most people are at work, or they're at school, or they've got something else to do. So they're not going to turn up. So that means thinking about, is it after hours? How do I engage with them? Where are they going to be? How can I have that conversation and how can I do that in a way that is human and respectful for them? So I think if you want to build social capital and actually have a relationship, you need to invest in that relationship. Absolutely. It's key.
And with empathy, right?
And with empathy, yeah.
So I've got a couple of more questions which we'll try and get through quick. This one's really rating its socks off, so I have to have... It gets to your engineering speak comment before, I think. When working with ministers' offices, various comms teams in national departments, so branch, division, how does one manage too many cooks, i.e. multiple people editing articles to the point where key parts of it get lost? Jarrod, quickly, Jane, quickly,
right.
give us a bit of a tip on this one.
Yes, there are always lots of cooks in the kitchen. I think the key thing that I have found is it's actually getting the people into the room and coming to an agreement on what's the core point that we want to put across, who's the audience that we're going to communicate with, and how do we translate that speak? So I've sat in a room with engineers in the past and actually sat there and gone, okay, you write it. Okay, now I'm going to write it. And they can go, and I go, right, so I've written this. What do you think? And they go, well, that's not right. And I go, okay, tell me what's wrong so I can make it accurate. So it's actually partnering with the experts. I think when you start to get lots of people coming in editing, it's when they feel that they've lost control of what's happening and that you may not be actually respecting what it is that they want to take across. So again, it's about investing in that relationship with understanding those things. As you start to build on those relationships, people will let go a little bit. They'll start to go, oh yeah, no, I can trust that they've, that they've understood. I can trust that they are respecting what it is that we want to get across at this point in time. But look, it's always a challenge, and somewhere along the line, you need a great executive above you that you can go, this is going pear-shaped. Let's work out where we can draw the line in the sand about these things. So, and ultimately, the minister will have the final say on how they want to present it.
Jarrod's chomping at the bit.
Yeah.
I could tell a war story. I remember sitting in an estimates hearing in the back room with 5 people working on a document while somebody is typing stuff in and the person next to me is deleting it as they're typing it. So, yeah, that was a great experience. Ultimately, you're right. I think you've got to have the capacity. You need a subject matter expert, but you also need somebody who's in an executive position or a leadership position who understands technical speak, but also understands normal, what I like to call normal. And having the ability to see the material and filter it through into language that other people can understand. And it needs to be a single person who's accountable through that process. Feed it back and say, is this correct? And most engineers, I work with a lot of engineers, will go, well, technically but it's like, is it correct? Like, for a normal person without the technical expertise. And that fact-checking stuff is that tick. But yeah, you really need to filter that kind of communications through and be clear about what is the message. Be clear with your instructions. I need a media release that does this, and then try and follow it through. But it's challenging.
Okay, thank you. I think I got a tip online to get to the upvoted questions because we were running out of time, and I think I kind of killed 2 birds with 1 stone there about the technical accuracy piece, and also, you know, bringing people together to make sure it doesn't get lost. So I think we've kind of covered off on that, which is great. I'm also just going to read this comment because I love it, which was that point I made about misinformation, and somebody said, on the topic of on misinformation, never wrestle with a pig. You get dirty, and besides, the pig likes it, which is absolutely fabulous. And that was not the advice I was giving you, by the way, just to be clear. And then, Jarrod, one more question I think we'll have time for here is about your regulatory information. Was there any particular approaches directed at creating demand for that information in various audiences? Communication is, after all, heard in the place where it lands, not in the place where it is generated. So how do you get people excited about what you want to deliver?
That's a really interesting question. So this is where we've got to balance the whole. We've got obligations around privacy, so you can't go and harvest a whole bunch of email addresses and use that to spray your information out to people who've expressed an interest. But you really should look at how do you make the most engaging content you can have. So, you know, I was out at Warralong Dam, did some film, bit of footage of the dam spilling, which was really quite nice. We had the most engagement we can. So make sure that you're being as creative as you possibly can to try and get people to follow your social medias and things like that. And then use your peak bodies. So, you know, we used to filter a lot of stuff through peak bodies because they're the ones who are going to push the information out to the regulated community. So, and that's about that relationships. You should have a really good relationship with your peak bodies. That, again, it should be no surprises about, look, this is where we are going to be in 2 or 3 years' time, and this is the communications tools we're going to use. Because most of the time they'll go, well, our members, you know, we require a social licence. We don't want to be in the frame for, you know, the reason everything's gone wrong. You know, we want people to do the right thing to be acknowledged for that. We want people who don't do the right thing to have action taken against them. So that's the other sort of tool that I would use.
Yeah, great. And thanks for reminding us about peaks. Got a comment in the chat about, you know, why so much emphasis on the media. There's more effective communication channels around there, not the be-all and end-all. And I don't think any of us are suggesting that they are, but they're obviously a very big part of our society. So, you know, thank you for bringing the peaks to mind. And the City Hall clock tells me it is time. We unfortunately are at the end. Thank you to our speakers, for our online audience, and for people here today. It's been great participation. Quick plug, the next NRCoP webinar in December the 14th, it's our WA colleagues. They'll be hosting a session on COVID and the lessons for regulators at all levels for crisis. The WA Chief Health Officer will actually be at that event. So that's a good one to tune in for. And given everything that we've said today about the criticality of good comms, we can't go without at least telling you this little bit of information. NRCoP is currently developing a 6-module professional development program with 1 full module specifically targeting regulatory communications. How exciting is that? Look out for your email. It'll be launching into your e-box around November. Please keep up to date with that sort of stuff. Keep connected to this community. This is what we are here for. It's about regulators, built by regulators, for regulators, to help you in your everyday work to be more effective regulators. Thank you so much, busy people, for taking the time to join us today. We hope that you really enjoyed that session. Please thank our speakers.